Energy Transition, episode number 71. Our topic today is cracks in Net Zero Insurers Alliance, NZAI. IA. NZIA, exactly. It's an alliance, not a collusion, okay, of course.
Of course.
Irina, Irina Slav, Kenny Nimet, Dave Blackman, and me, Armando Cavanha. Good morning to all.
Good morning.
Morning. Good day.
Good day.
Good day, yes.
Yeah, that's right. Irina, please, let's start with you. What is Net Zero Insurance Alliance and how and what's the reason it was created?
Well, it was the same reason for which the Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance was created, trying to unite companies from a certain industry, the financial services industry, so they can virtue signal, publicly and in a pack, so to speak, to set emission reduction targets, emission tracking targets, and emission reporting, and to force their clients to set emission reduction targets, all in the name of net zero. Now, the problem recently with the Insurers Alliance is that Republican politicians, Republican governors, state governments are after them, saying they are violating anti-monopoly legislation, which has prompted more than half of the members of this insurers group to leave it. And according to a Reuters story, the latest Reuters story, numbers are down from 30 members to 12, because more than half have exited. And the reason they've exited is that the alliance, which is a creature of the United Nations, has tried to obligate them to set emission reduction targets and to track emissions, report, yada, yada, you know it. So they have got scared that they will be made accountable in the US along anti-monopoly lines. So they're quitting, which prompted the group to remove all requirements. Nothing is mandatory anymore, but they are encouraged to set targets, and they will be held publicly accountable for, following through with these targets. It was really interesting because publicly accountable to whom?
Right.
To the environmental groups who will chain themselves to the doors of the
right.
of
Yeah.
the insurers.
And
or
to
the
Antonio
asset owners.
Guterres, who will scream loudly about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably.
But tell me, United Nations and other institutions have influence on these targets, on this, let's see, administration of this alliance?
That's a really good question, because it comes to this. If I can just add to what Irina said about where it came from, it's all part of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which was what came out of the Glasgow COP26. And it's the GFANZ is the umbrella organization, but there's all of these other little breakoffs. So you have the Net Zero Asset Owners, you have the Net Zero Banking Alliance, you have the Net Zero Insurer Alliance. And so they've got these different elements of the larger GFANZ. And the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero was what Mark Carney was working on. And it's also linked to the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is part of the International Sustainability Standards Board now, or they've adopted the TCFD metrics. And so there's this new thing that we talked about before, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is sort of working with all of these different entities to come up with these standards, which if a company's operating where they're mandatory, they'll have to follow it, which includes a lot of, for example, they have to say how many companies they're insuring are based on an ESG metric. And then they have to follow what their emissions are and so on. So for this insurance alliance, and most of the members seem to have been from Europe, the Europeans are going to be requiring that information. So they don't necessarily have to follow what the alliance is saying, because they're going to have to do it anyway, because the EU is mandating it. The ISSB, if it gets adopted by a country, it'll be mandated that way. And so they'll be forced to do it anyway. So I think of it kind of like Larry Fink saying he's embarrassed or ashamed to have been using ESG because it's become politicized, but he's still going to do it. Call it something else.
Yeah.
And the Insurance Alliance will still do it. They'll still track the emissions. It's just not going to be said in this alliance specifically. So if it's the UN, the ISSB, or the TCFD or whatever, they're still going to do it anyway.
Interesting. David, do they have some kind of commitment, declaration of commitment? And another point, antitrust laws and regulation does not take effect in this situation?
Well, I think that was the threat, of course, that we had 23 Republican attorneys general, state attorneys general, because our federal Department of Justice is completely corrupt and doesn't really enforce antitrust laws at the federal level. But you had these state attorneys general, threatening to bring litigation that would be very costly against these insurers if they continued to engage in clear antitrust behavior. I mean, when you look at the reason why the antitrust laws in the United States came about in the first place, it was because of companies like Standard Oil banding together with other companies to deny capital and services and markets to other companies, players in the same industry. And this is an example of insurers that were banding together to deny capital and markets to companies engaged in certain types of projects, like drilling for oil and gas or mining for coal and energy-related projects that they didn't approve of. And that's not legal in the United States, or it didn't used to be until we lost all sense of ethics and law at our federal Justice Department. The financial companies, ESG companies, Vanguard and BlackRock and all these other ESG-focused financial groups have been engaging in the same behavior, denying capital, denying funds to companies that engage in projects they don't approve of. And we all know they've been doing it. They've been boasting about doing it. Okay. And as Tammy noted, we just had this spectacle of Larry Fink, who pretty much really invented the whole ESG thing just 5 days ago before we're recording this, saying he's now suddenly ashamed to be engaged in the debate because it has been, quote, politicized. Well, who politicized it? I mean, this whole net zero, every policy choice that's being made by these Western governments to move towards net zero is a political choice. It's all a political game. Every action involved in it is politics. It's political in nature. And so, this, I first became exposed to the ESG thing at a company when I was at a company called El Paso Corporation in 2007. And we got our first letter from an ESG focused investor. And immediately our general counsel at that company said, well, this is antitrust stuff, isn't it? I mean, this is a bunch of investor groups sending these letters around to companies, to encourage them to engage in certain types of behaviors. And by denying them capital. And yes, I mean, clearly it's antitrust behavior. And that's what it's been for, 16 years ago now. And so it's nice to finally see this week the House of Representatives in the United States, a committee, the Judiciary Committee in the House, now suddenly mounting an investigation on antitrust into the ESG investor group. So whether it's insurance or investment houses that control trillions of dollars in capital, this kind of banding together to discriminate against certain individuals or company in the marketplace is in clear violation of U.S. antitrust laws. So I'm glad to see it's finally happening. It's about time.
Excellent. Tell me, what's a kind of commitment that do they have in terms of, among the companies, among the alliance, in terms of the alliance?
Well, thank you so much for putting it up there. I sent you the link, and that's if you go to unepfi.org or you just Google search NZIA, NZIA, and commitment, it'll tell you what the pledge is. So every time a company signs on to one of these UN convened alliances, they sign a pledge, which is very strange, but they sign a pledge. And and one of them is that they will commit their company to do net zero by 2050 and try to to reduce activities where it's going to increase the GHG emissions in order to keep the global temperature to 1.5 degrees, whatever. So the net zero transition pathway. And they sign all these different things. My company makes this commitment with the expectation that governments will follow through on their own commitments. That's on page 3. So it's like this 4-page pledge of all the different things they're committing their company to do. And this is the insurance one. So they'll have to participate in these meetings. They're going to designate an officer. They have they're going to make an annual monetary contribution. So they're paying for their membership in this alliance, which I think is rather amusing.
It's a privilege to pay for a privilege.
It's a privilege to pay for, right? And
yeah.
In the International Sustainability Standards Board financial disclosures, their guidance for insurers is that they have the capacity to influence behavior. And they say it directly. You can influence the behavior through ESG metrics. And then they talk about incentivizing healthy lifestyles and safe behavior and develop sustainability related projects. How nice. How wonderful.
Yeah.
Insurers can do this instead of just providing you insurance. Yeah. They're going to tell you how to live now.
David, in which level of a company these things are committed? It's not in the normal employees.
Well, even normal employees of companies have to be careful not to engage in antitrust type behavior. I circulated an email to y'all this morning talking about the fact that in my career, I was engaged in a bunch of different industry-wide projects, that included representatives from, dozens of different companies in the industry. And we had to start out every meeting. We made it a practice. Every meeting we held, we started with an antitrust warning, not to engage in any discussions about prices or markets during the course of this meeting, because it could potentially be in violation of U.S. antitrust laws. And all the goals Tammy was just talking about these companies are pursuing are fine. There's nothing wrong with the goals if they want to pursue them. What they can't do in the pursuit of them, if they want to do business in the United States, is discriminate against people in the marketplace in pursuit of those goals. You can't do that. It's not legal. And if you want to do business in the United States, then you have to avoid that kind of behavior. And and it applies to every employee at every company, not just the CEOs like Larry Fink.
So it's interesting to me, just wanted to ask a quick question, what you think. So as Tammy said, the European insurance majors will be forced to report emissions and set targets, etc., because of EU legislation. So, for example, Allianz and Zurich Re can discriminate against the hydrocarbons industry in Europe, but they wouldn't be able to do it in the United States because antitrust laws would go after them. How does that work? Does it just sound ridiculous, or is it really ridiculous? So they'll be very green and very target oriented and everything in Europe, but they will not be as responsible in the US because they'll be violating antitrust regulations and legislation. No, seriously.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It will be fine to refuse project insurance coverage to, for example, Shell in Europe, but they wouldn't be able to refuse it in the US because there'll be a violation.
Yeah, I mean, our laws don't have any bearing in Europe, and I don't know. I'm assuming some European nations have antitrust statutes that are similar to what we have in the United States, but I don't know that, honestly. I don't know if they do or not.
They should.
As David mentioned before, not only in the insurance sector, but the ESG sector are in the same, let's say, confusion. But why legislators are taking care of these issues only now, not a long time ago that things are happening?
Well, now I think it's coming to a head now because of all these proposals that are out there to spend not billions of dollars, but trillions of dollars pursuing these goals. These net zero goals. We had this story in Bloomberg this past week, that Bloomberg NEF, their analysts have decided, well, it's going to not cost $100 trillion globally to get to net zero. It's going to cost $200 trillion. And the headline says, but yeah, that's cool. That's a bargain.
Totally.
It's a bargain. $200 trillion, which is twice the collective GDP of every country on earth we're going to spend. Okay. I mean, it's an impossible number that people who write about it don't even understand the magnitude of it. And so when you have policies that are being put out there, policy choices that would try to print that much money and target the subsidies to all these green solutions, that gets people's attention finally. Before it was a cottage industry that, okay, they're not going to fund Exxon's project in Guyana or wherever. That's not really that big a deal. But now suddenly it's more about we're going to basically bankrupt the global economy in pursuit of this goal and do it really. I mean, if you tried to do 50 trillion in the next 5 years, you'd bankrupt the global economy. And so it's a big deal now. It's a lot bigger deal, and it's gotten the politicians' attention. And, unfortunately, it only has the attention of Republicans and not a single Democrat. And that's pretty extraordinary, really, in and of itself. But the next time you have a Republican president who appoints a Republican attorney general, I suspect you will see a really focused effort to start enforcing the antitrust laws, targeting any of these companies who are engaging in these kinds of practices, whether it's related to ESG or insurance or any other business. And I think that's the big concern that's starting to rise among these insurers and these ESG investment houses right now, because when you look out to 2024, there's a pretty decent chance a Republican's going to win that election. So it's not too early to start preparing for that outcome.
I would just add something to what David said. I mean, right now, the United States hasn't put forward any of their climate-related disclosure rules. And the Securities Exchange Commission has been dragging its feet on this. I don't know what they're waiting for, but it was supposed to have been out in spring. Then they said summer. Now they're saying fall or the autumn. So it'll be interesting to see what they actually come up with, because if it's regulated, if companies are mandated to do this, then that absolves them to some extent from antitrust legislation, because they're being told they have to do this. And so it'll be interesting to see what the SEC comes up with in the autumn. And then the other thing, I was listening to a webinar with some bankers, and they were very high up in some banks. And they were talking about how these new standards, these financial disclosures are really important, because every company will have to be thinking about climate for every decision they make within the company, which sounds to me a lot like religion, so it's like everything they do will have to think about climate and environment and sustainability and biodiversity and what their impact is, not just how the weather's affecting them, but how they're affecting the weather. And it has to be embedded in everything. And I thought that was a bit disconcerting that banks would be taking that position.
That's insane.
Yeah.
It's literally insane.
This is the opportunity they have to change contracts, rules, regulation, because this kind of threat.
Well, possibly internal corporate policies and regulations, as Tammy said, but again, if the SEC is dragging its feet on those ESG regulations, it might have something to do with antitrust legislation. Maybe they're trying to find a way around it. Based on everything that David and Tammy said so far, I'm thinking that maybe that's why they're taking their time to regulate ESG disclosures and emission tracking and reporting and setting targets. Maybe there's a grain of sense and decency still left somewhere there. So that they're not coming out straight out and saying you will report and that's that, you will not invest in polluting industry and that's that, industries and that's that, because that will be an antitrust problem, as David detailed.
Yes. I suppose, Dave, that they have a very high level a combination, a kind of a commitment among them to solve these problems. It's not possible to take this risk without protection.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that we see these global conferences that happen, as Tammy noted. The ISSB guidelines came out of COP26. We're about to have COP28, and the big narrative that's happening in advance of COP28 is that oil and gas companies need to come prepared, and coal companies need to come prepared to submit their own net zero plans. Everybody must be mandated that everyone do it by the UN, I guess, or maybe the World Economic Forum is going to mandate it. They seem to be an unelected global governance now. And so, yeah, I mean, all these policymakers at the senior level in all of these countries attend all these conferences every year, and they get browbeaten during those conferences, and they agree to pursue common goals during those conferences. Mm-hmm. and they come out of them and go back to their countries and pursue those goals. And it's probably more difficult for U.S. policymakers to do that than in some other countries, just because of the way our Constitution, with its separation of powers, is set up. And so even when the SEC, for example, issues its regulation on these disclosures, which it will do in this administration, and I suspect before the end of the year, there's going to be immediate litigation that will take years to get through the court system. And you currently have a 6-3 majority on our Supreme Court that is probably not going to be inclined to give the SEC a lot of leeway in this regard, because this is an aspect of our system that the SEC has not delved into to this point. And so in terms of trying to force climate-related activities within companies. And so they're going to be plowing very new ground that probably is going to give litigants 100 different avenues to challenge in the courts. And it'll be 5 years at least before you have any final settled law around that regulation. And so I suspect the main reason why it keeps getting delayed is that they can't figure out how to structure it without giving opponents so many avenues to sue them over. And it's a tough deal for them. They can issue those regulations, but doing it in a way that's going to get approved by our court system is a pretty difficult thing.
Well, David, are those rules enforceable? Will companies have to follow them if it's before the court?
So what'll happen is, you'll end up with probably a dozen different lawsuits, major lawsuits, and federal judges. It'll first go to the federal courts at the district court level, and you'll have district judges issuing nationwide stays on enforcement of the regulation, and then it'll go to appeals courts, and depending on which appellate court it's in, they may say no, that stay can't be effective, but the other appeals courts will uphold the stays, and so it's going to be mass confusion for several years once that regulation is issued, and companies are going to be starting and stopping compliance efforts off and on for years, and it's the way our system works, and until you have a final Supreme Court decision sometime around 2028 or 2029, no one's really going to know what the requirement really is.
It's going to be fun.
Yes. It's job security for a lot of lawyers.
Yeah, no kidding. Wow.
Money for them. Yeah. So let's see if you approve the suggestion I have to the conclusions. Suggest to Stuart to insure his Tesla Model Y at NZIA member.
Those would be
I think
eligible.
that sums it up. Yeah. It's an interesting world we're living in, isn't it?
Very, very.
It'll be expensive to insure that Tesla because there's lots of concerns about the batteries on fire. And so
David, do you have let's see, a number for this insurance of a Y model?
Oh my gosh, no.
A normal car. Normal car is a
normal car? A normal car, our insurance runs us about $2,000 a year for our car. I don't know what it would cost for a Tesla. The Teslas are a little more expensive than the cars I'm able to buy, so I'm not sure.
Let's ask Stuart. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Y'all have a great week.
Monday. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.